And thank you everyone for inviting me. I wish I could be there in person. I have to do that another time. Um, so I'm going to talk about some work that I've been doing with Piotr Zok, who was a grad student at Chicago, is now at the University of Warsaw, about markups, labor market inequality, and the nature of work. So this is part of a broad research agenda that I've been thinking about, which we've been trying to develop a framework to get some insights into who are the people in the economy that benefit and who lose when markups change. Now, there is a large existing work thinking about this issue, but almost all of that work focuses on the factor income distribution. So the distribution of national income between between workers, people who have claims to labor in the economy versus people who have claims to other factors or economic profits. So in other words, the labor share. Our focus is a little different. We want to dig into the labor income distribution itself and ask how do changes in markups shift income between different types of workers performing different activities in the economy. Now, the emphasis that we're going to face is on the interaction between markups and the demand for different types of inputs. And so what we're going to do is distinguish between different ways that labor is used in the production process. Why are we doing this? Well, markups are a central mechanism through which shocks, policies, changes in the economy propagate over both the short term and the long term in many different classes of macroeconomic models. So in the long run, trends in competition, changes in market power, changes in technology often propagate by changing markups. And in the short run, the most ubiquitous model that we have to think about the propagation of monetary and demand shocks propagates by changing markups. So these distributional implications that we're going to emphasize are relevant over both the short and the long run. Now, the key insight of the paper is going to be to distinguish between two different ways in which labor is used in today's economies. So we're going to use the words Y-type labor or production labor to refer to the use of labor in generating revenue for firms that comes from the production of existing goods for sale in existing markets. We're going to use the words N-type labor, and it will become clear why we use these words, or expansionary labor, I'll use those interchangeably, to refer to the use of labor in generating revenue for firms that comes from facilitating expansionary activities, which are basically replication activities of either new goods or new markets. And I'm being specifically vague at this point, and I'll become more precise as we move on. So I'll give a formal definition of this distinction. The key insight is going to be that these two different uses of labor are differentially exposed to changes in the economy that move markups. What's different about them is whether or not the factor inputs, the Y-type or N-type labor, whether they increase the revenues of firms by effectively shifting out demand curves or by moving along demand curves. And what we'll show is that when markups change, they change the incentives of firms to want to use inputs that facilitate these two different outcomes, moving along a demand curve versus shifting out a demand curve. So what I want to do, I'm going to do something a little bit unusual. Before I kind of jump into the paper, I want to start by explaining this idea in the simplest possible framework that I can. With one slide, I'm going to show you a model that I think captures the basic insight of the whole paper. And then the rest of the paper is going to be to pursue the implications of that insight in general equilibrium and take it to data and try and do some measurement. Okay. So bear with me. So I want to show you a very, very simple firm problem. So simple you can present this to undergrads. And you just think about one firm that hires two different types of workers, Y-type labor and N-type labor, and they choose prices and quantities to maximize their profits. They hire the Y-type labor LY at a wage rate WY in some competitive labor market, and they hire N-type labor LN in some competitive labor market WN. Now, the one thing that's different about the standard model is we're going to allow this firm to be able to choose the measure or number of markets in which it operates. So the firm chooses N, the measure of markets that it operates, and every market is symmetric. And in each of those markets, they face a standard downward sloping demand curve with a constant elasticity sigma. The firm chooses how many of these markets to operate in, how much output to produce, and by construction, then that output is used to sell in these different markets. We're going to assume that the production function for goods, Y, which then is used to sell in each of these markets, is just a standard isoelastic production function with elasticity gamma Y. And this gamma Y is going to play a big role in everything that comes. I'm going to call it the production elasticity. It's just the elasticity of output with respect to labor. And the challenge here is this firm, if they want to sell goods in multiple end markets, they have to hire N-type labor in order to manage that process, to manage the expansion of the firms, or to oversee the sales of and the operations in these N different markets. And we're going to assume a standard span of control type production function where operating in more markets N requires hiring more N-type labor with an elasticity gamma N, and I'm going to refer to that elasticity gamma N as the expansionary elasticity gamma N. That's the problem. This is a very, very simple problem. In a simple case where gamma N equals 0, so if gamma N equals 0, then the N decision becomes irrelevant, and the firm just operates in a measure 1 of markets, and you get the standard monopoly problem that's in every undergraduate textbook. So this is super, super simple. If you take the first order conditions of this problem, we could all do it in a few minutes, and you rearrange them. You can derive the income distribution of this firm. You can ask, where does all the revenue that it produces go? And the revenue of this firm is just the price P that it will charge, which is going to be the same in every market, little p, multiplied by the output that it sells, Py. And what you'll see when you do that is that some of the firm's revenues are going to go to profits, economic profits, and some of it are going to go to labor. And the share that goes to production labor, Y-type labor, is going to be given by gamma Y times 1 over the markup, where the markup is very simple. It's just given by the demand elasticity sigma over sigma minus 1. Whereas expansionary labor, the share going to that is also given by the elasticity gamma N, but it's given by 1 minus 1 over the markup. And this immediately has several really important implications. Number one, when markups rise, there's a redistribution of the firm's revenues between production labor and expansionary labor. Very clear to see why. What's the intuition? The intuition is when markups are higher, the firm moves back up its demand curve, reduces its output in every market, and hence it hires less workers. But there's more it's now earning higher gross profits in every market, so there's more incentives to expand its activity and replicate its activity into different markets. So it's going to hire more N-type labor. How much it does that is going to depend on the elasticity gamma M, which captures the decreasing returns to that activity. Second thing to note, what does this mean? It means that when markups rise, the share of labor income going to some workers in the economy rises and some falls. In the standard model where gamma N equals 0, an increase in markups always redistributes national income away from workers and towards the owners of the claim, the people who have the claims on the firm's profits. But when some of the workers in the economy are N-type workers, performing activities that are better described in this way, then an increase in markups actually can redistribute income towards those workers. And in fact, it will turn out that whether or not an increase in markups increases the overall share of labor income going to workers is ambiguous. And you can see straight away from these equations, if you do a little bit of algebra in your head, that it's going to depend on the relative size of these two elasticities, gamma Y and gamma N. When gamma N is bigger than gamma Y, an increase in markups actually increases overall labor income. So this basic idea turns out to be much, much more general. It's present in all sorts of models with entry. It's present in growth models, in models where we think about any sort of extensive margin activities. And all I'm going to do in the remainder of the paper is I'm going to embed this idea into general equilibrium, see how general it is, and use it as a way, as a laboratory, to learn which of the workers in the economy are performing activities that are better modeled as these Y-type workers or these N-type workers. Okay, let me just describe the outline, then I'll pause for some questions. So the first part of the paper, probably the first 30 minutes, I'm basically going to redo what I just did in a general equilibrium structure, and I'm going to give you 3 theorems that make clear those 3 points about the effect of markups on the overall income distribution. We're going to do it in a framework in which there's multiple occupations, and we're going to attribute Y-type versus N-type to different occupations. In the second half of the paper, I'm then going to exploit some of the findings from the theory to develop a strategy that will allow us to measure both the extent and the identity of N-type labor in the U.S. economy, and to just give you a hint of what that's going to come from. It's going to be sort of clear almost from what you've already seen, that we'll be able to learn the extent of N-type workers in the economy by looking at the co-movement between the labor share and the markup. And we're going to use business cycle fluctuations in the US economy, and I'll talk about the proxy for the markup, aggregate markup that I use. And to identify the identity of N-type labor, we're going to do it at the occupational level, and the way it's going to work is by looking at the co-movement between occupational income shares and markup-induced fluctuations in the aggregate labor share. And I'll show you some formulas that explain exactly why that reveals the end content of different occupations. Okay. That's let me pause and take any questions at this point.
May I?
Great. Go ahead.
Thanks. So this is Ernesto. So this preview of the result is great because it put us all in the same page. Something that it seems to me that is an assumption there is that there is no suitability between the N type of workers and the Y type of workers. And if we think about the motivation, is probably more related to tasks that could be performed by the same type of guy, or different type of guys may perform them. For instance, when you were thinking about marketing, the marketing guys are there to try to expand the markets of the firm. So they are N type of workers, but they also are there to try to sell more to the same markets. So in that sense, they're like a Y type of workers. So I wonder how much of the results rely on the assumption that there are different occupations as opposed to different tasks that can be combined by the same type of occupations.
Okay, there's a lot of things there. So firstly, the question about marketing, you could interpret the notion of a market here is really, do you have to move down a demand curve or can you shift out your demand curve? So if one of the roles of marketing is within the same demographic, geographic product market, you expand the number of goods that you can sell without having to lower your price. That's N-type activity as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so in that case, the second question you asked about substitutability, I mean, I've made no assumption about that. The point of showing you a firm problem and not describing the labor market, and I'm going to say nothing about the labor market in this talk, is because the results I show you, it just doesn't matter. All that matters here is that the firm can hire labor and takes the wage as given when doing that. Whether the workers are fixed to an occupation or whether they can substitute freely between occupations or between N and Y, that's irrelevant for these results, because these results about factor income shares, I mean, and that's why I'm not looking at levels, I'm only looking at shares, they don't depend on that. Now that's special. Okay, admittedly, it's special to having isoelastic production functions. There's something nice about kind of Cobb-Douglas that gives you that, but I think it's a really useful benchmark that this is really just coming from firm optimization, not from and doesn't really depend on the constraints that workers face on shifting between. The third question you ask about tasks versus occupations, I'm going to do this at the occupation level because I don't presume to be able to separately measure Y and N type activities directly, exactly because it's such an abstract notion. But right at the end of the talk, I'm going to correlate them with standard task-based content of different occupations from ONET, and we'll be able to look at some of the tasks that typically are associated with N and Y type activities. Okay. Were there any other questions?
Yeah. I wanted to kind of clarification question on the sort of role of the extensive versus the intensive margin and sort of where you draw the line. I guess kind of related to what Ernesto was saying, but I was thinking more on like quality versus new market. So you can also think of you're using workers for investment, sort of improving the quality of an existing product, but it's sort of within the same market sort of definition, but that worker would be, according to your definition, would that be a worker, an N worker or a Y worker? Imagine that
I don't know.
the number of varieties. I mean, does it matter or not?
No. Okay. So firstly, there's again two things here. So one is expansion of varieties in terms of preferences, and I don't want to think about love of variety. I mean, we could. It's just going to have another layer. I want to make a point. This is not about love of variety. This is really about where is the border of the demand curve that firms face, and then that's up to you as a modeler to make that choice. My point in this paper, if there's one thing to take away from it, is that economics doesn't think hard when writing down the role of workers in our models of which of these roles they're playing. And I'm going to say it matters a lot. Now, which one? In reality, I think we all do a little bit of both of these types of things. And I'm going to show you a strategy for within the occupation. Basically, all I'm going to be able to tell you is what fraction of the labor income of a particular group compensates activities that look like Y versus activities that look like N. I'm not going to be able to go and say, well, that's a Y and that's an N. It's just too abstract. But we'll be able to break down a fraction into each. And I think the point I'm trying to make is that it really matters when we write down a model what we assume. Typically, we just assume that gamma n equals 0. And we don't worry. We say all the workers are Y-type workers. And by the way, that is the source of the conventional wisdom that there is an inverse mapping between markups and the labor share. It's here. It's this equation here. And all I want to point out is that as soon as you think that there are at least some people in the economy who may be better described as N, that goes away. And we can talk right at the end about who's better modeled one way or the other way. I'll do it at an occupation level, and then we can dig deeper after that. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to do things at an occupation level. That is just a choice. So we're going to consider a fixed set of J occupations, and we're going to, in every occupation, you can hire workers of that occupation to perform Y-type activities or N-type activities. Okay, so I'm not saying that an economist does N and a machinist does Y. I want to think about economists as doing some N and some Y. If you're an economic consultant, you spend some part of your time producing economic services. That's a Y-type activity. And you spend some type of your time going in and convincing people that they should buy your services, or going and setting up offices in different locations, or providing overhead to be able to sell those services or increase your capacity. Those are N-type activities. Therefore, the labor market clearing in each occupation is going to say that the total amount of labor supplied in each occupation that has to be equal to the labor demanded by firms for Y and N type activities. And again, I'm going to have nothing to say about this LJ. It can be determined however you want it to be determined. There'll be a wage in every occupation, WJ. I'm going to separate the economy into two broad sectors, an upstream sector and a downstream sector, which is going to be useful for when I go to some of the data and how I measure markups later on. So I want to think about a representative upstream firm that's going to hire the production labor in the economy, and again, hires in the competitive market. So basically what I'm doing is I'm separating these activities into an upstream and a downstream sector, whereas in the little problem that I showed at the beginning, it was just an integrated model of a firm. Doesn't matter. You're going to get the same results in both cases, but it's going to be easier to take it to general equilibrium in this setting. They produce a homogeneous intermediate good M. which they sell in a competitive market. So the profits of this representative upstream firm is their revenues from selling the intermediate good minus the wages that they're paid to the workers in every occupation. And we're going to assume that they produce with labor, which is a Cobb-Douglas aggregator of the workers in every occupation. And so here there's kind of two key parameters in these sets of parameters in production function. One is this gamma y, which is the same gamma y that I showed you before. It's the overall production elasticity in the economy. And then there's these eta jy's, which tell you the relative importance of different occupations in the production of goods. Okay, so these are production shares. They sum up to 1, and they're non-negative for all the occupations. This firm might make profits if gamma y is less than 1. That's standard profits from decreasing returns to scale. Okay, these are intermediate goods. The intermediate goods are then going to be sold to a downstream sector, and I'll explain the downstream sector in 3 different steps. So there's a measure 1 of identical downstream firms, and what they're doing is they're going to hire expansionary labor or N-type labor to manage different product lines or markets. Each of them has to decide how many product lines / markets to operate, and it's the same problem that I had before. In each of those markets, they're going to earn some gross profits pi I, where pi I is the profits in each market. Everything's going to be symmetric. So in equilibrium, these gross profits will be the same. And they take these profits as given when deciding how many markets to operate in. I'll describe those profits on the next slide. Again, they hire N-type labor from every occupation, analogously. And they face the similar standard span of control expansionary production function when deciding, which determines how many markets you can, or product lines you can manage for a given set of workers. And again, the same key parameters, it is gamma n, which is the overall expansionary elasticity for the N-type labor aggregate, and then these eta jn's, which tell you how important are different occupations in providing expansionary services to the production process. And those things are non-negative, add up to 1. These downstream firms can make profits if gamma n is less than 1, in which case these gross profits are not completely eaten up by entry. If gamma n equals 1, then it's basically like a model with free entry where sorry, Eric Hurst trying to call me. That's with Skype. Where gamma n was equal to 1, then these profits would be 0 because all of the gross profits would be eaten up by entry. Where do those gross profits come from? Well, we'll just assume that each product line produces a differentiated good yi, and that these goods are differentiated costlessly by taking 1 unit of the homogeneous intermediate good and converting it into 1 unit of the differentiated good, and hence the total aggregate output of the downstream sector is just the total amount of goods produced, differentiated goods. Now later in the talk, I'm gonna one of the reasons why I separated out like this is later in the talk I'm going to make reference to an extension of the model where we allow for more production labor to also be used in the downstream sector in this differentiation of goods. So that would break this very simple relationship between intermediate goods and final goods. Okay. Though in each of those markets, the downstream firms then sell those goods to consumers at a price PI, which we're going to write as a markup mu over the marginal cost, which is the marginal cost, just the price of these upstream goods, these intermediate goods. And hence the gross profits in each line is just given by the markup and the demand curve that they face in each market. Now, I've remained purposely vague on what the actual market structure is that gives rise to these markups. In the paper, and maybe in a slide or two, I'll say a few of them. The reason I've been vague is because the theorems that I'm about to show you, they hold for a broad array of market structures. Okay. I understand though that it's hard for a lot of people. The markup is like typically an endogenous object, and what I'm going to do now is talk about the effects of a change in the markup. So it's sometimes hard to wrap your head around comparative statics with an endogenous object. If that's an issue for you, just think about monopolistic competition with constant elasticity of substitution, in which case the markup is just determined by a structural parameter, the demand elasticity. And you could think about shifts in that demand elasticity. But it turns out that it actually, everything I show applies much, much more broadly for other sources of movements in markups as well. And I'll talk about some of those. Okay. If you solve this, oh yeah, I want to point out one other thing. In this model, we can compute the ratio of the upstream and downstream prices. And because the only good that's used in the production of final goods is the downstream good, the ratio of those prices is just equal to the markup. I want you to store that as a bit of information, because later when I go to the data, I'm going to exploit that heavily, because I'm going to use data on these price ratios as a proxy for the markup. Right? Now, in this baseline model, it's exactly true. In richer models, it's going to be approximately true, and we'll have to deal with that a little bit, which we will. I'm going to focus on symmetric equilibrium. In a symmetric equilibrium, the price sold in every market is the same. The goods sold in every market of every product line is the same. And the amount of intermediate goods sold for production in every final product market is the same. Market clearing says the total amount of goods produced have to equal the total produced for each used in each product line times the number of product lines. And so nominal GDP is just the price times the total amount produced. Take the same first order conditions of these various firm problems, apply these equilibrium conditions, and you get an exactly identical set of now not about the individual firm's revenue, but we have national income in the economy. So we can describe the distribution of income in the economy. It looks like this. It should look exactly the same as the single firm problem. Again, income in the economy goes to labor and profits. Profits go to the upstream and the downstream sectors for the reasons that I've described. Decreasing returns to scale and not eating up all of the gross profits through entry. That's these. And then the labor share in the economy goes to the production expansionary workers with exactly the same shares as in the single firm problem. So this should make it clear to you that nothing that I said here is really specific about the general equilibrium. It's true even in a model where a single firm makes all of these decisions. It's a very general point. And the second thing I want you to notice about this is that the factor income distribution in this economy is determined by only three things. Two structural parameters, gamma y and gamma n, these two elasticities, and the level of markups in the economy. If you tell me those three numbers, I can tell you the distribution of income in the economy. There's some special cases here. Again, the standard one sector model where there's no expansion, that's just the Y-type labor model. That's gamma n equals 0. When gamma equals 0, all of the income, labor income goes to Y-type workers, and the labor share is just gamma over mu. That's the very, very standard formula. And in that case, the profits, there's still going to be some profits in the downstream sector and in the upstream sector. The income share of a particular occupation. Now, I'm not going to, later I'll come back to this formula, but I'm not going to go through the derivation, but it's actually very intuitive. You can show that the share of total income in the economy that goes to, say, economists, so the total wage bill to economists divided by total income, is a weighted sum of the total labor income going to Y-type labor and N-type labor, so these labor shares, the production expansionary labor shares, weighted by the relative importance of that occupation in production versus expansionary activities. So the way this is set up, occupations that have high eta JYs and low eta JNs are going to behave like the most like production labor, Y-type labor, and vice versa for ones with high Ns. So to understand the exposure of a particular occupation to movements in markups, we're going to have to identify these etas for each of the occupations. And that's what we're going to do. Okay. Any questions about the model? Because now all I'm going to do is I'm going to take these equations and just formally state three theorems about the effect of a change in markups on the economy. Okay. Question 1. How do markups redistribute labor income between production and expansionary labor? By now, I'm just kind of beating a dead horse at this point. An increase in markups lowers the share of income going to production labor and raises the share of income going to expansionary labor. And the intuition, again, very, very simple. For the production labor, it's the standard intuition that when you have higher markups, you are cutting back on production and earning higher profits. But because you're earning higher profits in every product line, you now want to replicate or enter more, so that whatever factor is used more intensively in that replication process, you're going to increase the income payments to those types of inputs. What does it mean for workers? In standard models where gamma n equals 0, all workers are negatively exposed to markups. That's sort of the source of the conventional wisdom that the increase in markups must be bad for workers and good for owners of firms. But if gamma n is bigger than 0, then some workers in the economy are positively exposed to worker markups, and we're going to have to find out who they are. Okay, so changes in markups redistributes income within labor. Question 2, how do markups redistribute labor income between the different occupations? Well, if you construct the relative labor occupational income share, so now this little sj is the share of the total labor income in the economy that goes to economists. So now we're just looking at labor income and how is it distributed across different occupations. If you just can do some undergraduate level algebra, manipulating those equations, you can get an equation that relates the relative, I'll call these things relative occupational income shares to the markup. And it depends on two things. You can see the key thing, it depends on these gamma y's and gamma n's. That's just sort of a scaling factor. But the sign of that effect depends on the relative size of a to jn and a to jy. In other words, whether or not a markup shifts income towards a particular occupation or away from a particular occupation depends on what the relative size of the importance of their usage in n-type versus y-type activities. And it's going to be higher or lower depending on which, it's going to be positive or negative depending on which one of these two are higher. This suggests a strategy for how you might learn about the n or y-type content of occupations. If you can see whether their relative labor income shares rises or falls with markups, then that's going to tell you something about the relative sizes of their a to jn's and their a to jy's. I said all that. Question 3, how does markups redistribute total national income between labor and accounting profits? So in this simple model without any other inputs, accounting profits and economic profits are the same thing. But this statement is true even if we add additional factors of production, in which case it's just a statement about the labor share relative to other types of capital income and economic profits. Combining those two equations, we get a very, very simple formula, which says that the overall labor share, I just added up the two labor shares, has an is ambiguously related to the markup in the economy, and whether an increase in markups raises or lowers the labor share depends on the relative size of the production elasticity and the expansionary elasticity. Now remember, in standard models, gamma n equals 0, so it's always the case that this thing is positive. Gamma y is bigger than gamma n. I'm going to try and convince you that the empirically relevant case is actually the opposite one. It's gamma n bigger than gamma y. We're going to strongly estimate that, which is going to sort of overturn conventional wisdom that a change in the markups actually increases the labor share. Of course, it doesn't mean it's good for all workers, because it's the n-type workers that the income is generating a lot of redistribution. But overall, if gamma n is bigger than gamma y, then an increase in markups actually will raise the labor share. And in the second half of the paper, I'm going to explain how we reach that conclusion. Okay, that's the theory. I've shown you a whole bunch of economies that could have different gamma y's, gamma n's, and mu's for the same overall labor share. When gamma n equals 0, there's only y-type labor, markups redistribute income away from labor. When there's some n-type labor in the economy, gamma n bigger than 0, then an increase in markups redistributes towards some of the labor in the economy. And when there's a lot of n-type labor, turn out that a lot is really like, our numbers just to tell you where we're going to get to, they're going to be like 20%. In other words, gamma n bigger than gamma y, then an increase in markup actually can increase the overall labor share. And more importantly for us, what we want to focus on is that the n-intensive occupations are going to be ones where an increase in markup shifts income towards those occupations. So now in the second half of the talk, what I want to do is raises some questions that I want to get some answers to. Question number one, how much n-type labor is there? Which of these three cases are we in? Question number two is, who are they? Question number three, have they changed over time? Now, one thing you might want to do is, I think Federico kind of hinted at this, is you just one sec. You might be tempted to go look at like ONET and try and say which tasks are n-type tasks and which tasks are y-type tasks, and try and connect some conceptual notion of n and y. I think that's really hard, if not impossible, to do. I think we all do a lot of these different types of activities all the time. So I'm going to go an opposite way. I'm going to let the macro data be informative tell us about what's happening with n and y. And then after that, we can go and try correlate that with some of these more direct measures, rather than presuming to know from that we have a direct grasp on the n and the y. Okay, let me take some questions before I jump to empirics.
Great, yeah, here, this is Gustavo. I guess we're going to address some of these later, but you were talking about that you abstract from other inputs. So I was thinking that maybe capital also can have like these two different types of purposes. Like basically you have capital for producing, and you also have some sort of capital to expand into new markets and to other, markets broadly defined. So basically there could also be something going in that direction. And I don't know if, my question is basically if you address that possibility when you measure gamma n and gamma y later.
Yeah, yes, you could. For sure, you could take the same exercise that I'm about to do. I haven't shown it to you yet, and do it for capital. It's a bit harder because we need the data requirements are hard. It's hard. Getting payments to capital, getting payments to labor is easy. Getting payments to capital is really hard. I mean, that's kind of the whole focus on this kind of accounting for factorless income type exercises, taking the stuff that's not labor and splitting it between economic profits and payments to capital is hard. With the right data, you could do exactly the same thing. We haven't done it. What we do show in the paper is that with regards to the results on labor, including capital in the model doesn't change that. I mean, as long as, we need some assumptions for that. We need like weak separability between labor and other inputs, but conditional on those assumptions, it doesn't really matter for what I'm about to do, whether I interpret the non-labor income shares as capital income or as economic profits.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Okay, let me give you an overview of what the process is going to be, and then we'll jump into it. So we're going to estimate the key parameters in 2 steps. In step 1, I'm going to put aside the occupations and estimate the aggregate parameters, gamma y and gamma n. And the intuition is exactly what I've said, that it's going to use the final of those 3 observations, that the co-movement of the labor share and markup will reveal the relative size of gamma y and gamma n. Given that, given the knowledge of those parameters, that's sufficient to give you a number on what the overall share of n-type labor compensation is, just from combining gamma y and gamma n with data on the labor share and a number for the average value of the markup, which we'll take from. We'll look at different values for that. Once we have those parameters in hand, we'll then move to step 2, which is to estimate this set of occupation-specific parameters. And there we'll just do a similar exercise where we exploit the first 2 observations, which is that labor income shifts towards n-intensive occupations in response to a markup-induced increase in the overall labor share. So step 1 is going to tell us that a change in markup shifts the overall labor share. Great. Step 2 is going to tell us that when that happens, it doesn't shift the overall labor share in a neutral way. It shifts them away from some occupations towards others in a systematic way. And those shifts have a structural interpretation as these eta parameters. That's the idea. Okay. Start with step one. So step one, we're going to start with this equation that you've already seen, which is just the factor share parameters. Comes from those factor shares. It's the relationship between the overall labor share and the markup. We want to produce an empirical analog of this equation. So what we're going to do is allow for trends and shocks to all of these parameters, and then we're going to work with detrended data at business cycle frequency. So the challenge that we have is that, look, if you just stare at this, what would we like to do? We would like to project the labor share on the markup. Okay, what's the issue? The issue is we have to take a stand on where the variation is coming from. Now, both the labor share and the markup are subject to very strong trends over time. There's a whole literature just on both of these two things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on business cycle frequencies, because at business cycle frequencies, I can take the stand that these gamma parameters are not changing. It's a very standard assumption to assume that at least the business cycle frequencies, technological parameters are not changing. These are elasticities. And so we will do that. What we're going to need data on the markup at business cycle frequencies, and we're going to need data on the labor share. And our key identifying assumption is going to be that at business cycle frequencies, all shocks to the labor share, all movements in the markups affect the labor share only through the channels in the model. In other words, there are no additional missing forces outside the model that are moving both the markup and the labor share together at business cycle frequencies. And conditional on that, we're going to run regressions of detrended labor share data on detrended inverse markup data, and recover gamma n and gamma and the difference as the constant and the intercept and the regression coefficient in those models. The challenge is that we need data on the markup and the labor share. So let me show you those. So the labor share is the easy one. We're just going to use, it actually doesn't matter what measurement of the labor share we use for this, that we get very similar results. So our baseline, we'll just use quarterly data from the BEA using post-war US data. We're going to follow the approach in Gomez and Rupert. That gives us the black line here for the labor share. You can see this well-known decline since the 1970s in the labor share. We're going to focus on the cyclical movement. So we're going to detrend with a Hamilton filter. And the other lines here are all the a whole bunch of other different measures of the labor share. There's a lot of dispute in the literature about which of these measures to use. It matters a lot for the trend. So some of them have, like the purple line, has much less of a trend than than say the blue line and the level. But everything we're focusing on is the cyclical variation. And the cyclical, once you detrend these, they all look basically identical. Okay, so that's what we're going to focus on. I'll just point out, if you want to know where a lot of the identification is coming from, this is one of the most counter-cyclical series that you'll see. In every recession, there is like a peak of the labor share. It peaks in the recessions and drops in the booms. Okay. Markup data. So that's the second one we need. So that's the challenging one. So if you're familiar with the literature on markup estimation, there's basically, broadly speaking, two approaches to estimating markups. One uses puts structure on the demand side of the economy, makes some assumption about the market structure and tries to measure consumer demand elasticities and infers markups from that. The other uses production data and uses equations like the factor share equations that I've shown you, either the aggregate, starting with Bills and Hall, more recently Nakata-Ramey would be the classic reference on this, or at the firm level, which is the classic references is, again, Hall was like the first, and DeLocca, Wozinski, and more recently DeLocca, Eckhart, Unger. Some people in the firm level estimation, you call this the ratio estimator. Why? It's very easy to see. If in the model with gamma n equals 0, the labor share was equal to gamma y over the markup. That's true for any variable input. So the idea is you just take the ratio of a variable input to its production, the share of payments to a variable input to its production elasticity. That gives you the inverse markup. Now the problem is that any of these approaches are not valid in the context of our model. Why? Because as soon as you introduce n-type inputs, that type mapping between the production elasticities and the labor share disappears. In fact, we want to go the opposite. We want to use data on the markup to tell us about that relationship. The whole existing literature imposes gamma n equals 0 and then recovers the markup from the elasticities in the shares. We need to go the opposite. We can't do that. It's just a non-starter. So,
Greg, if you have data, for example, between production and non-production workers, could you do something with production workers? I mean, there are some.
But then we could, but then we don't need to do. Then I could drop everything that we do, and that's saying that I can identify the N type and the Y type workers.
Okay. Yeah.
My whole point is that at a big level, the whole point of this paper is that this idea that we can just call someone production workers in manufacturing and supervisory workers, and that's the Y and the N, to me, that's insane. Like, I think the whole point is that in a modern economy, we're all doing these types of activities all the time. And we can't distinguish like that. So I go back to the example of an economic consultant, that we just spend some of our time generating new customers and some of the time producing economic services, and it's just not true anymore. And I guess also even in manufacturing, like most of the labor in manufacturing, we're going to turn out is mostly N-type labor these days, and that's exactly because of the declining labor share in manufacturing. So, so same goes for materials. So another answer is, well, you don't have to use labor. You could use other inputs in the ratio estimator. But again, you would have to be able to distinguish between which of those inputs are being used in conjunction with N-type activities versus Y-type activities. And I don't want to presume to know that. I want to learn about that. Okay, so what we're going to do is something a little different. We're going to exploit the fact that in the context of our model, there's a mapping between the markup and the ratio of prices at different stages of production. In particular, in the very simple model, the markup is just equal to the price ratio between the downstream price, which is the price of price of differentiated goods paid for by final consumers, to the upstream price, which is the price of undifferentiated goods that are produced by raw materials, capital, and labor. Now, it turns out that the producer price index series produced by the BLS produce price indices that match very closely these definitions. We're not the first to take this approach. I think there's a nice paper by Barrow and Tenreo that do something quite similar. So we're going to build on that. And the two producer price index series we're going to use is one for finished demand as our downstream price, and one for processed goods for intermediate demand at our upstream price. And we're simply going to take the ratio of these two series, and we're going to take the detrended version of that. Now, of course, because we're looking at the ratio of two indexes, it doesn't give us the mean level of the markup. It only gives us the variation, and we need to know the mean level. So we're just going to assume different values for that. At a baseline, we're going to take 1.2. But if you believe, I'll tell you how the numbers would change if you believe that number is very different from 1.2, some other number. Here's what the series look like. So the black line here is just the labor share data that I showed you from the last period. The red line is the price ratio series. It's got a lot of cyclical variation. It's also very countercyclical. It maps up very closely with the labor share. In fact, if we detrend these series and plot them, we're going to get a strong positive relationship in the between the detrended price ratio and the detrended labor share. So this is like a visual. This is just a visual of the regression that we're going to run, and you can see that the positive relationship is exactly what's going to tell us that gamma n is bigger than gamma y, because that's the way we get a positive relationship between changes in the markup and changes in the price ratio. When we run those regressions, that's exactly what we find. We estimate values of gamma n of around 0.8 and gamma y of about 0.6. So quite high elasticities in terms of gamma n, but gamma n bigger than gamma y. And of course, and those together with the measure assumption about the mean markup will give us an implied value for the share of total income, labor income in the economy that compensates N-type workers. It depends a lot on the level of the markup. So that number is about 21% when you assume a mean markup of 1.2. If we're moving that mean markup assumption between 5%, 35%, we get numbers between 6% and 32%. Regardless of the value assumed for the mean markup, it's always the case that gamma n is bigger than gamma y, and a non-trivial fraction of labor income in the economy is is compensating n-type workers.
Correct?
Yeah.
May I ask a couple of questions?
Sure.
This is Ernesto. One is, what will happen with the estimations if mu will be endogenous to the, I guess that to the n and the y's in some way? And question two is regarding production networks. So here there is a very simple structure for the production chain. In reality, it's much more complicated. So accounting for the true structure may make a difference on the numbers?
I don't know about the production network question because I haven't thought hard. I mean, the way I think about this is that these forces operate at every stage of production, that wholesalers have to charge markups are at every stage of production, and there's n-type work in all sorts of everywhere in production. So I think you could I'm not going to say quite easily, but I think that will be a great exercise to expand what we've done to a model of production.
The forces will be there, that's for sure.
How you take it to the
forces
data
will be there. The point is quantitative.
Yeah, I don't know. I just don't know. That would be down the line, and someone's interested in who knows better about production networks like you guys. I'd be very happy to explore that. But yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I think it would be interesting to be able to estimate these numbers at different stages of production and see how they change. My guess is that n-type labor gets more important as you come further down the production chain, but I just don't know. Endogenous markups. It depends on what's driving the endogeneity in the markups. So in the paper, we go through a large number of different market structures that have endogenous markups, and we clarify what types of shocks would be consistent with our identification assumptions. A lot of them will work. So, for example, one model of endogenous markups might be, say, an Atkinson-Bernstein type structure with where markups change because of shocks to, say, the relative productivities of Z and the breadth of productivities of expansion and production. That will be fine. That will work. Basically, it's anything that's going to change the anything that doesn't change these production elasticities. The resulting movements in markups would satisfy our theorems 1, 2, and 3. And you will be able to run these regressions. I think that's it. So yeah, you can take a look at the paper. We go through a whole bunch of them. I can come up with ones for which it wouldn't work. One where it wouldn't work would be if you took, say, again, an Atkinson-Bernstein structure, and there is some shock to gamma y versus gamma n. That wouldn't work. Then we couldn't use this. Yeah, I mean, it's basically anything that changes the overall labor share and the markup through a mechanism other than the one that we've described. And that's, yeah, most of these models don't have that feature, but you can construct things where it would fail.
Thanks.
Okay.
On the same line, can you ask you, I mean, one alternative is not so much thinking about the market structure driving the markup, but like technological dynamic. So I was thinking like, Michael Peters, the market paper, kind of, driving markups because of sort of a forward-looking dynamic problem of investment. And so one thing you can think about is sort of something technologically that's happening and sort of affecting markups and labor share at the same time. But I guess you're saying that by looking at higher frequency variation, you're kind of abstracting from that, or
yeah, look, I think you would have to write down the model. Within the context of the model, you have to add n-type labor into that framework. So there's some technological change that is going to increase that. There's going to be some direct effect on labor. Then there's going to be some effect on markups. The indirect effect of those markups on labor is going to work like in our economy. Okay, so there's going to be a component that will be followed it, because just think about it. You have markups go up, but now there's an incentive to want to replicate. So that force is going to be there. The point is that there's going to also be a direct effect of whatever that change was, maybe on the labor share, and you would have to have a way to split that out to get to identify, to use this strategy in the context of that model. I think the biggest concern with what we've done here is that our proxy for the markup is these price ratios. And the biggest concern with that is that the only reason why the price ratio is equal to the markup is because the way I set up this general equilibrium structure is that you produce final differentiated goods by buying the homogeneous goods and then costlessly differentiating them. So there's no additional value added in the downstream processing, and hence all of the gap between the downstream price and the upstream price is markup in our model. But it may be that this red line is capturing not only movements in markup, but also movements in value added in that downstream sector. And if that value added is labor itself, then that would also explain why these things move together. And then we're not, this is not going to work. So what we do in the paper is we expand the model to allow for downstream for Y-type labor in the downstream sector. I'm not going to go through it because I'm conscious I only have about 15 minutes of time. That's right? But we do that, and we re-estimate the model, allowing for the use of labor in production, and the markup now is no longer equal to the price ratio anymore. But even though the markup's not equal to the price ratio, it still has information. The price ratio still has information about the markup in it. So as long as we can purge the price ratio of the labor component, we can still use it as valid variation. So I'm going to skip over the way we do it. Basically, you get an equation that relates the markup to the price ratio, but we also need to use data on real wages. So we use data on real wages, and we need to make an assumption about another elasticity, which we also can estimate as well. And when we do that, here's some estimates. Basically, we get very similar values for gamma n. The interpretation of gamma y changes a bit because it doesn't have the same interpretation, but we get the same. The estimates of gamma n don't really change, and our estimates of the overall elasticities, overall share of labor income compensating n-type labor remains the same. So I'll refer you to the paper. I'm happy to talk about this extension afterwards, but we deal with that. Okay, in the remainder of the talk, I want to talk about things at the occupation level. So the occupation level, the basic idea is going to be the same. Let me flip back. If you remember, in Theorem 3, I had this equation that, where was it? This one, that related the relative share of an occupation's income, labor income, to the markup. Well, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my relationship between the markup and the overall labor share and substitute it in. I'm just going to do some more algebra. When I do that, I end up with this equation. Which relates the share of total labor income going to a particular labor income to the overall labor share. There's a nice analogy here with like demand system estimation for consumption. This is the way to think about this. This is like an angle curve. It basically says when the total share of income on goods expands, how does the distribution of income spending across, say, consumption categories change? That's what this is, but for occupations. It asks when the total labor income share of national income going to labor increases, how does it shift the distribution of that labor income across occupations? Okay? And you can see that whether or not it shifts to or from depends on these A to Jn, A to Jy. So what we're going to do is we're going to use an IV strategy where we project occupational income shares on markup-induced movements in the overall labor share. Right? So it's important that these movements in the labor share are being driven by the movements in the markups. And so that's what we'll do. Again, we work with detrended data. We add trends. We explain that we can take out the trends. detrended data to add shocks, and then we exploit 3 different types of variation to do this. So the most natural one is to just use the detrended markup as an instrument. Why? Because within the context of our model, the only thing that can move, the only reason why a change in the markups would impact on the relative occupation share, say, of economists, is by shifting the overall labor share, and then because economists have different exposure to that labor share. So we can use the markup as an instrument, and that's going to be our baseline. But we can also directly just use the detrended labor share itself, or we can literally be a little bit less glued to the model and take a kind of a broad approach and say, actually, sort of any variation that only shifts the labor share by moving markups is going to be a valid source of variation to estimate this with. So one example of that is monetary policy shocks. Why? Is if you take kind of any new Keynesian model, pretty much any model we have for the propagation of monetary policy, the only reason why monetary policy or any demand shock for that matter in these models moves the labor share is by moving the markup. I mean, that's the way. You can't get a movement in the labor share. These things move the labor share by moving the markup. And in fact, there's a really nice paper in the JME by Cristiana Cantore, Felipe Ferroni, and Miguel Leon Ledesma, who look at the impulse response function of the labor share to monetary policy shocks, and find very, very strong responses, and actually argue that you can't explain those monetary policy labor share responses to monetary policy shocks in the context of a new Keynesian model. In fact, it goes the wrong way. Why? It should be kind of obvious now. It's because there's no N-type labor. But with N-type labor, in fact, you can. And these are a beautiful instrument for these monetary policy shocks are a beautiful instrument for the markup. So then we don't need to use the markup. What we can use is monetary policy shocks directly as an instrument for the labor share. And in the paper, we do that as well. It turns out that we get very similar results regardless of which of these 3 sources of variation we use. So I'm going to show you the results with the detrended price ratio, the detrended proxy for the markup. In the paper, we have the monetary policy shocks and the occupations. I mean, this also is, what's nice about this is it makes it relevant for, I guess, you guys do monetary policy at central banks. We have a theory of why a movement in monetary policy shock will shift the distribution of labor income. And in fact, one of the reasons I originally got interested in this was thinking about how can you generate distributional impacts across different types of workers of monetary policy shocks in Hank models. And the idea was simply to put N-type labor into Hank models. Okay. Here's the raw data. There's a lot of, these are the raw, we're going to look at 9 broad occupation groups. That's these occupation groups here. They've trended in very different ways over this period. So managerial occupations and professional special occupations, the share of labor income going to those occupations has increased a lot, whereas machine operators and administrative and support occupations have declined a lot. So there's big differences. We detrend all of them. And then we work with the detrended, quarterly detrended data in these variables. Now, if you stare at this, you might look at it and go think about, oh my goodness, how could you ever get anything? It doesn't look like there's a lot of cyclical fluctuations in there. Well, we're going to get something out of here, and it's going to be very reasonable what we get. So let me show you why we get it. So this is on the right-hand side here. What I have is a graph that shows the intuition for where the identification comes from in these regressions. This is what I'm plotting here is the second stage of the IV of the IV regression. So remember, the first stage of the IV regression is the labor share on our detrended labor share on the inverse markup. Well, it's the inverse labor share on the markup because remember the regression is the inverse labor share. So in the second stage is the inverse labor share. So what I've plotted here in the blue and the red is I've split the data based on the results that I'm about to show you. So the red occupations are going to turn out to be the most N-intensive occupations, the occupations that turn out to have the highest N components. That's high-tech occupations, service occupations, and managerial occupations. The blue one are going to be the occupations that turn out to have the highest Y-type components: machine operators, agricultural, transportation, and construction. I've plotted on the x-axis the cyclical movements in the detrended inverse predicted labor share. So sometimes they have a high, sometimes the overall labor share is high, sometimes the overall labor share is low. On the y-axis, I've plotted for these two different occupation groups how much of the overall labor income is going to those occupations. And what you see is a very systematic difference between them. In periods where the inverse labor share is high, the relative share of income going to these blue dots is high and the red dots is low, and vice versa when the overall labor share is low. And remember, this is the detrended predicted labor share based on movements in the markup. So this is markup induced fluctuations in the labor share. They tend to systematically move the labor income distribution away from some occupations and towards the others. And it's the fact that these lines have different slopes that through the lens of the model, then we interpret, you can see these different slopes here. It's these, how do you get a positive or a negative slope? You must have an eta n higher than an eta y or vice versa. So that's why for these different occupations, we're going to estimate them have a high eta n or a low eta n, and hence why we'll interpret them as having high n intensity or low n intensity. So that's the intuition. This is the actual results of the estimation. I've ordered them from the most n intensive at the top to the least n intensive at the bottom. You can see that the overall share of labor income compensating n-type activities within these occupations varies quite substantially. It's the highest is the high-tech occupations, like over 27%, whereas for the ones at the bottom, it's more like 11%. One thing that you'll notice about this, which I think is amazing, if you would ask us to take, I think it was Federico who suggested this at the beginning, why don't we just like think about the tasks that are most likely to it? And I gave you these 9 occupations, and I said, why don't you rank them? Which ones feel just got to feel more like N or Y? I think you'd get like, you wouldn't get exactly this. I think I would have put sales occupations closer towards the top, probably, to be honest. I might have put admin and clerical towards the bottom, but you know, they're quite complementary to a lot of the N-type activities. But I would have put these are mostly blue-collar jobs. These are mostly white-collar jobs at the top, which is kind of amazing because I didn't use any information about what these jobs actually do. I didn't use the names of these in any way. We just literally looked at the share that goes up when the overall labor share goes up as a result of markup-induced fluctuations. And there are systematic differences, and they're large differences in how exposed these occupations are to movements in the overall labor share. Some negative, some positive. Okay, in the last 5 minutes, I want to kind of look at the properties of these occupations. In the paper, there's some other things you might be concerned about. And in the paper, we deal with them. Like a big one that you might be concerned about is that industry variation. So right now, we just have all the occupations and kind of just an upstream and downstream. But what if there's lots of different industries in the economy, and some industries are just more cyclical than other industries, and some occupations are just used more intensively in those industries? Then it may be the case that what we're picking up is not the fact that high-tech occupations of higher N-type intensity, but rather that high-tech occupations are used in particular industries that are more exposed to movements in markups. So in the paper, we extend the model to allow for a set of industries, and we re-estimate these per model. When you do that, it is indeed the fact that some of this variation disappears. It becomes more flat across occupations, but the ranking basically stays very, very similar. Okay. The last few minutes, I want to talk about the characteristics of these occupations. So what do we find about them? So what I've done is I've plotted on the x-axis these different occupations, and I've put their N-type share, ranging from the ones with mostly doing Y-type stuff to doing a lot more N-type stuff. Okay, the first thing you find is that there's almost no correlation between the average wages and the N-type share. Amongst the occupations that have high N intensity, there are both high-wage occupations, managerial and high-tech, but there's also a lot of low-wage occupations, services, admins, and sales. So in other words, there are high wage occupations, high and low wage occupations can both be high N intensity. But if we look at growth in wages across the 35 years from 1980 to 2015, we find a very, very strong relationship between the N intensity and the occupations that have had highest wage growth. Right, so the highest wage growth is high tech, and again, we didn't use any of this information in the estimation, so this is really independent variation. So it's kind of amazing. It says the occupations that have tighter co-movement of their relative labor income shares with markup-induced changes with the overall labor share at business cycle frequencies are systematically those occupations that have had the highest wage growth over this period. Okay, store that. We can also do the same with employment, and we see the same thing. So if we look at the total hours, so this is like prices, it's wages. So this is this is prices. It's the wage of different occupations, wage growth in different occupations across the versus the N-type share. This is now quantity. It's the growth in hours or employment. So this is growth in the share of hours. It's also positively correlated. So if both the quantities and prices have gone up in these N-intensity occupations, one way to rationalize that is that the demand for N-type occupations has grown relative to the demand for Y-type Y-intensive occupations over this period, which is totally, at least to me, seems very plausible, that N-type activities are becoming more important in the economy from the point of view of labor demand. So we've approached this occupational heterogeneity through the lens of this very macro perspective of just looking at and interpreting through the lens of the model. There's a big literature on these shifts in the occupations over the last 35 years. Most of it has focused on task-based measures. So a natural question is, how well do these correlate with task-based measures? So I'm just going to end with just some pictures that take the basic manual, abstract, and routine definitions from Otto, Katz, and Kearney, 2006, the broad measures, and I think it's kind of surprising. So the focus of that literature is mostly on the growth in abstract occupations. We don't see a lot of correlation between N-type share and abstract or the routine content. We see a relatively systematic correlation between the manual content, which makes sense because I remember I said the Y-type occupations were these white blue-collar workers, and that's consistent with the manual content of those occupations. So you can think about this as almost being an alternative way of thinking about the changes in occupations, but not through the lens of task, but through the lens of what the role of those workers are in generating revenue for firms in different market structures. Okay, I am, I think, exactly out of time, so I'll conclude. If you take something away from this talk, it's that we think it's important to differentiate between what we call N-type expansionary activities and traditional Y-type production activities when thinking about labor income distribution, specifically when thinking about how changes in the economy that affect markups impact on the labor income distribution. We estimate that around 20% of labor income in the US currently compensates N-type activities. These are very heterogeneous across occupations, and that those N-intensive occupations are those that have experienced fastest wage and employment growth in the last 35 years. More broadly, we've tried, obviously, a very, very simple model, and I started the talk with the simplest possible structure I could think about, but I think this point is much, much broader and gives you a way to think about the distributional consequences of all sorts of changes in markups, whether they're secular trends in competition, secular trends in production structures, cyclical movements in demand, and a lot of the other forces that have been discussed in the recent literature on competition and market structure. Thanks for your time.
Great, thanks, Greg, for being careful about the time. So we have a bit more than 10 minutes for discussion, so feel free to shoot away your questions. I have like one question, kind of going to your measure of markups. Like if you use that measure to see sort of longer trends in the US, would you get something similar to what other people have found using the other versions of markups that they use to estimate, or like how would you reconcile your model with these longer trends of falling labor share and rising markups, or maybe with your measure of markups, it's no longer the case that markups are going up?
Okay, you got to remember that all of that every other piece of work, they don't. Okay, firstly, no one observes markups. Let's be clear. What we observe is a bunch of things in the data. Then through the lens of a model, we manipulate those things in the data by running some regressions, dividing one thing by another. So it's just stuff from the data. And then we say that if you do that, take that combination of the data through the lens of that model, that's equal to a markup. Okay. No one can dispute that that combination of things in the data has changed in the way anyone says it's changed. It's just data. What you can dispute is through the lens of a model, is that thing that's changed the markup? Obviously, through the lens of our model, no, it's not the markup. So in some sense, if with my hat on in this paper, I would say, well, those are not evidence that the markup has moved. It's an evidence that something has moved that is a combination of the markup and other stuff. Okay. I don't really have skin in that game. It's just, it is what it is. Like a good example would be not on trends, but on cyclical stuff. So Nakata Ramey which is I think the best paper on the literature on the aggregate cyclicality of markups, comes out with a very strong finding that markups are either mildly pro-cyclical or acyclical. Everything we do is our data set's exactly the same thing. It's just that what they take is not the markup in our model. We have countercyclical markups. Our model has countercyclical markups, but the same moments would give exactly the same thing. So, so there's an issue there. Are markups increasing or decreasing? Our price ratio, if you remember that figure, it's actually been declining over a bunch of the period. That price ratio. I believe it's this red line. So it's sort of flat, and then it dropped a lot in the 1970s, was increasing over this period. Okay, so I mean, read what you want into that graph. Data is what the data is. You could take this model, you could replicate everything that's been found and still be consistent with this. It's just that there's a different interpretation of what the profit shares are. That's all.
Anyone else?
Since there is no one else, I'm going to jump in again. So Federico is interested about the long run. I'm interested about the business cycle. So all the discussion, all the presentation, I'm trying to think about the role of countercyclical markups and thinking about one way to extrapolate what you are doing to something that can tell us something about the labor share. The labor wedge. I know that you don't want to talk about that, but clearly there is a connection. There are some people pushing that markups are a big driver of the labor wedge, and this gives us a different angle of the effect of markups on the labor market. So have you thought a little bit about those two things?
Yeah. So okay. So this is a model when gamma n is bigger than gamma y. This is a model with countercyclical markups and a countercyclical labor share. Okay. So the challenge normally is that how do you reconcile? Okay. The labor share looks countercyclical in the data. Okay. That's kind of hard to dispute. I mean, it's kind of probably the most countercyclical series you're going to find. The want operator for a lot of like New Keynesian type models is countercyclical markups. So that literature is really about how do you reconcile a countercyclical labor share with countercyclical markups? Well, the answer has to be that there has to be another wedge that's moving in the other direction. So in some sense, this model kind of reconciles those issues. I mean, this is a model that can give you a countercyclical markups with a countercyclical labor share.
Why? Because you no longer have that inverse mapping between the labor share and the markup. They're no longer one over each other because you've got this other term, and in fact it goes the other way around. So and so this is a model where the wedge is still just a markup. I mean, it's the actual wedge. I mean, when I say wedge, I mean take the planning problem relative to the equilibrium. The wedge is just the markup. Now there's the measured wedge, which is, well, if you only look at some particular types of labor and so forth, and that depends on how you measure it. So in a sense, what we're proposing an alternative model for how you could reconcile countercyclical markups with the countercyclical labor share, and also, by the way, and pro-cyclical profits, which is that's the other thing. Like the profits can be pro-cyclical with the markup being counter-cyclical in this model because the N margin come and eats up a lot of them as they're going. That's an important. I mean, maybe I'm getting too much in the weeds here, but if you take Smets-Wouters, I don't know if that Smets-Wouters. That's kind of the classic paper on estimating a medium scale DSG model using business cycle variation. You look at the parameters of that model. That model has an operating cost in it, which is just like a fixed operating cost. You look at how important that is. It's like 70% of GDP. It's insane. Obviously, that's not the case, but no one really focuses on that. Why does their estimation push them so strongly to want so much of the variation, so much of the labor income to be paying to this kind of weird overhead cost? It's really exactly because the estimation is trying to reconcile counter-cyclical markups, which you need for the impulse response of monetary policy shocks to work, with the fact that the labor share is counter-cyclical. It has to break the average share from the marginal share, and that's the way it does it. This is just an alternative way of doing it that it's more open about it. When you estimate this structure in Smets and Wouters, you kind of get the estimates that we have. But why? Because the N labor is sort of standing in for that sort of overhead component. And because the basic challenge is, how do you reconcile countercyclical labor share with countercyclical markups? One option is you say markups are pro-cyclical. That's possible. I'm fine with that if you want. Markups are because there's no N-type labor. Markups are pro-cyclical. Go change your model. It's the model that's wrong. The other way you do is you try and find all sorts of tweaks and things to the model to try and that there's a lot of, and I'm not saying those are wrong. There's all sorts of ways that you might do that. This is just something. If you take this model, we don't have that problem to start off with. I mean, you might want to add those things still, but you immediately get countercyclical labor share and countercyclical markups when gamma N is bigger than gamma Y.
So before moving to point two, I just want to point out that I think that the smoking gun should be variations in N. I don't know whether that can be observable at the business cycle frequency or not.
Yeah, I'd love to, and that's a really great point. So if you take seriously the N, hard to observe N. So one definition of N is just in manufacturing is just number of products. Okay, number of products is pro-cyclical. If you take counter-cyclical markup, the number of products in our model moves with markups. N goes up when markups go up in our model. So with counter-cyclical markups, and that's not consistent. So there's an issue there, which would suggest, and this is connected to Hall's point on advertising. I don't know how well you know that paper, but the advertising point is exactly the N. It has the same formula. It has exactly the same formula as N in our model because it shows up in that first firm problem exactly the same way. So this is an old idea that any sort of activity that allows you to replicate on the extensive margin should go up when markups go up. So one thing you do is look for those activities, look for new products, look for advertising. They're all very pro-cyclical. That pushes you towards pro-cyclical markups. So there is a tension there. And so I don't really have a hat in the game on pro-cyclical versus counter-cyclical markups. I'm more interested on the fact that whichever one you think it is, when they change, it's different workers. It's different types of workers who are going to benefit and lose. That's to me the bigger point. But yeah,
Thanks.
We have a couple of more minutes, so if you have any other questions or comments. One question I had is whether you thought about, this is obviously not within this paper, but think about the role of imperfect competition in the labor market as opposed to output markets. And there's a big, I mean, a lot of evidence now about this in the US and how big of a deal this might be in driving down the labor share and so on. So what do you think about, adding something like that to this type of framework, and how would that affect, applications?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. We haven't done it. I mean, our model assumes that firms take wages as given. If firms took into account that they face demand curves, then differential labor supply curves. Differential labor supply curves in different occupations with different N-type intensities would generate another form of heterogeneity across these occupations and across N versus Y that we'd have to take into account or think about when you think about interpreting movements in the income shares. We haven't done it. I agree that would be interesting. I think, yeah, for sure, that would be really interesting.